Hello, book lovers, and welcome to another episode of Authors Love Bookstores from a Mighty Blaze. I'm your host, Joe Moldover, and I'm delighted to be back here with you today. Every week, I and my partner, Kimberly Hensel Lawrence, crisscross the US and beyond, talking about independent bookstores with the authors who love them. And today, for episode 147, I am delighted to be with William Kent Krueger, who goes by Kent. Kent, welcome to the broadcast. Thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Joe. Thanks for inviting me again.
Absolutely. For those in the audience who might not know, Kent is the author of 24 novels, by my count, 19 in the Cork O'Connor mystery series, most recently Fox Creek in 2022, and also 5 standalone novels, most recently the just released The River We Remember. He has visited the New York Times bestseller list with 11 novels and has won many awards, including the Edgar for Ordinary Grace, released 10 years ago, which is an extraordinary book. Um, Ken, completely delighted to have you here. Congratulations on The River We Remember. It's a wonderful book. The audience is delighted to have you. Hi, Robin. Thank you for joining us today. Um, Ken, I think a lot of the people who are joining us here are fans of yours, are fans of the Cork O'Connor series, are mystery readers. But for anyone who hasn't caught on yet, would you just give us a quick rundown, a quick elevator pitch on The River We Remember?
Sure. So, The River We Remember is set in the summer of 1958. I've set it in a place in southern Minnesota I call Black Earth County. It opens on Memorial Day, 1958, when the body of the county's leading citizen, a man named Jimmy Quinn, is found floating in the Alabaster River, which cuts through town, uh, dead from a shotgun blast and nearly naked. This really is a true mystery, Joe, in that the question at the heart of the story is who killed Jimmy Quinn and why. But that's not really what the story is about. Um, in the early 1940s, my father graduated from high school, enlisted in the military service, and marched off to Europe to fight in World War II. He was just a kid. He was 18 years old. He came back years later, a man deeply wounded in body and in spirit by what the war had done to him. I recognize now he was probably suffering from PTSD, but nobody talked about that back then, or if they did, they referred to it as shell shock or battle fatigue. And like all kids, I pestered my dad for war stories. Did you kill any Germans, Dad? He absolutely refused to talk about the war. And he was a lot like the fathers of my friends, guys who, like my dad, had fought in World War II or the Korean War, and they'd all gone away kids. Some of them not even shaving yet, and they came back men deeply wounded by the horrors that they had been a part of and the horrors that they had witnessed. And all my life, I've wondered, Joe, how could anybody heal from that kind of wounding? And what about the people they left behind? Their wives, their mothers, their sisters, their fathers, people who loved them and who I'm sure were praying for them desperately while they were all fighting, and maybe in the end lost them on the battlefield. How did they heal from their wounds? How did anybody manage to find a way to heal? And that's really what The River We Remember is about.
Yeah, that's a wonderful synopsis, and it's a beautiful book. One thing that you've shared in terms of your process of writing this book is that you actually started it a number of years ago, I think maybe 6 years ago, and then couldn't finish it, put it away, and then came back to it. And I wonder if you could say something about, what was that all about? What was it that made it hard to finish at the time? What was it that allowed you to finish it now? How much of that original manuscript remains in what we're holding in our hands here? What can you say about that?
Sure. Um, so 13 years ago, I pitched a story idea to my publisher, and they didn't want it. I went ahead and wrote that story anyway. across 3 years without a contract, I composed the manuscript for a novel called Ordinary Grace. And even though when I finished the manuscript, my publisher told me they didn't want it, I went ahead and sent it to my editor at Simon & Schuster. She fell in love with it. They published it. And Ordinary Grace had this really remarkable, really gratifying reception from critics and readers alike. It won tons of awards. It has been translated in more than 24 foreign languages. So far, it's sold well over 1 million copies. And when my publisher saw how well that book was doing, boy, did they want another book just like it. So I signed a contract for a companion novel. They paid me a huge advance. And I spent the next 2 years writing what I thought would be the companion novel to Ordinary Grace. As you pointed out, Joe, that manuscript was due to my publisher more than 6 years ago. 2 months before the contractual deadline, I set up a meeting in Chicago to talk to my agent about revisions to the piece because there were problems with it. I knew it. She knew it. 2 days before we got together, I sent her a note saying, when we meet, I don't want to talk about how we revise this piece. I want to talk about how we keep it from being published. Because it wasn't the story I'd imagined it would be. I had no idea at that point in time how to make it that story. And frankly, my heart wasn't in it anymore. My publisher actually turned out to be quite understanding. They said, fine, you don't have to give us this manuscript, but you still owe us a companion novel. So here's what was going on, Joe. The expectations for that follow-up novel were enormous. And the whole time I was trying to write the piece, I just felt crushed by the weight of all those expectations. And the truth is, when I was writing it, what I was trying to do was meet everybody else's expectations instead of writing the story that spoke to me from my heart. But as soon as I got all that weight lifted off my shoulders and I felt free again, I saw clearly the story I should have been writing at that point in time, a story that did speak to me from my heart. And so I started on that and wrote the manuscript for This Tender Land, which I published in 2019. Then the pandemic descended. And, for 2 years, we were all pretty much advised to stay at home. So in a typical year, I do 40 to 60 to maybe even 80 events across the country. But for 2 years, I couldn't do that. So I just stayed home and wrote. And I wrote 2 manuscripts from my Cork O'Connor series, Fox Creek, which you just showed, and Lightning Strike. I wrote 3 novellas. One of those was published as an audiobook original last February. It was called The Levee. And then I ran out of ideas. So I pulled that manuscript from the shelf where I'd put it over 6 years ago, pulled it down and opened it up and began to read it. And, Joe, I don't know how other storytellers operate, but for me, in order to do justice to a story, I have to hear the voice of that story speak to me. And 6 years before, I simply didn't hear that voice. But I went ahead and tried to write the story anyway. And the whole time, honest to God, it was like I was pushing the river. And as a result, I mangled it. I botched that manuscript. But this time when I opened it and began to read it, honest to God, I heard the voice that didn't speak to me 6 years before. And I wish I could tell you what happened in those 6 years. I don't know if the story just needed more time to gestate or I just needed to become smarter as a storyteller. But I heard the voice this time and I knew I could do it justice. And so across the next year and a number of months, I rewrote the manuscript. And to the point where that story that I thought was completely unsalvageable has become a story that I believe in deeply and love profoundly.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I have so many questions. Thank you to the audience for joining us. It's wonderful to see all of you and to appreciate your comments. If you have questions for Kent about his writing, about his books, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll get to as many as we can. Hello, Carol, coming from my hometown of Tenafly. It's wonderful to have you. Kent, I find it kind of fascinating that that it was difficult for you initially to sell Ordinary Grace. I mean, not only is it an extraordinary book, but at that point you had published a number of the Cork O'Connor books. I don't know exactly how many by that point, but I think probably at least 10 by that time. And they were very successful. I mean, it's really one of the most successful contemporary mystery series. And so when I'm sort of struck that when you went to your Simon & Schuster and said, here's a book I'm excited about, they were reluctant. And this is a little bit of a market question, but a lot of the people who watch this show are aspiring writers. So I always kind of like to talk market a little bit. But I mean, what do you think it is? I think Ordinary Grace is more of a character-based book. It's maybe a little bit of a slower paced book than your typical mystery. What do you think made that a hard sell?
Well, when I pitched the idea to them, um, there was history there. And so the fourth novel I wrote was actually my first standalone. It's a novel called The Devil's Bed. It's a political thriller. I think it's a really good political thriller. It's very dark. It's very different from my Cork O'Connor series, um, but it sold more poorly than anything else that I have ever written.
Hmm.
And part of the reason is that it wasn't a Cork O'Connor novel, and that's one of the pitfalls of writing a successful popular series. Readers are not necessarily going to be eager to follow you to a place that doesn't have the protagonist they've come to love and the sense of place that they feel like is home. And that was what happened with The Devil's Bed. I think 3 people in the entire universe bought that book. Um, it has developed a cult following. I get lots of emails from folks saying, why do you never talk about this book? It's really a good book, and it's simply because it really doesn't fit very easily into the rest of my canon. And so I suspect that was the reason they were not interested in seeing a standalone from me. They called me out to New York City and sat me down and said, Kent, you got to understand, we really only want Cork O'Connor novels from you.
They couldn't email that to you. They couldn't.
Well, I was out there anyway for other reasons and had a heart to heart with the person who was my editor at that point in time. And so without a contract, then it was a story it was an idea that so compelled me that I knew I had to write it. And so across 3 years without a contract, I went ahead and wrote that story.
Yeah, it's a great, wonderful book, and as I said before, Edgar Award winner. Yeah, Leslie loved it as well, and Leslie, you're going to love The River We Remember. Um, Ken, as you know, part of the purpose of our show is we are supporting independent booksellers. This is episode 147. We've um, supported independent booksellers in all 50 states, as well as DC, Puerto Rico, Canada, the UK. You tour, as you said before, you tour widely. You have an audience that really loves, I think, to come out and see you live. Would you say a little bit about independent bookstores and the place they kind of occupy in our kind of literary ecosystem? What you perhaps find special about going into independent bookstores and indie bookstore events? Any thoughts about that?
Sure. I said that I do 40, 60, 80 events across the country in a year, and probably 90% of those are bookstore visits, signings at bookstores. And I do this for a number of reasons. I go to a lot of small bookstores because when I broke into the business, it was the small independent booksellers who really helped my career get started. They hand sold my work. I'm aware that when I go to a bookstore now, back in the day when I first got started, it wasn't an unusual occurrence for me to set up a signing at a bookstore that was hours away from my house, miles and miles, and I would go all the way out there, spend all that time getting there, and it would turn out that the only ones present at the event would be me and the bookseller and the bookseller's cat. But I continue to make those trips because
That's happened to me, except I didn't get the cat.
it happens to every writer. It happens to every writer.
Yeah.
But that connection with the bookseller is so important, because if a bookseller likes your work and likes you, they're going to hand sell your work. Before you get there, they'll sell it. While you're there, they'll sell it. And when you leave, they'll sell it. So the small bookstores, the independent bookstores have really been those people who have encouraged me and supported me all the way along. And so I try to give back in that way. When I was growing up, Joe, I lived in lots of small towns, and every small town had a bookstore. And then I moved to the city and discovered that most neighborhoods in the city had a bookstore. And then Borders came along and we lost some of those stores, and Barnes and Nobles came along and we lost even more. And then Amazon reared its ugly head and we lost even more. But Borders is gone, And if you follow the news, the business news, Barnes and Noble has been struggling for a few years now. And if they were to drop out of the game, who do you have left? You have Amazon, that huge faceless entity for whom books are nothing but units to be moved. And who, Joe, and I don't know if you or the viewers know this, Amazon is putting enormous pressure on publishers these days in terms of what they want publishers to put out there. So you have Amazon, or you have your local independent bookseller who does what they do because they understand the power and the importance of the written word, and they do it because they love it. I know who I want in this game going forward when decisions are being made about the kind of books that are going to be available for us all to read. So I support independent booksellers to the max in any way that I can.
And to the audience, we support independent booksellers, and we are dropping links in the chat. If you are able, you need to head over to bookshop.org and support your local independent bookseller, not to Amazon.com. Excuse me, bookshop.com, not to Amazon.com. You support your independent bookseller through Bookshop. Pick up a copy of The River We Remember. If you don't already have it, pick up a copy of Fox Creek. Fabulous books, and that's what we try to do here. Ken, when you go out and you speak to your sort of your fans at these events, a lot of these people have been following Cork through, I guess 19 adventures over like 20 years at this point. Do they give you feedback? Do they ever say to you, oh, why did Cork do this? Or I'm really mad about this happening, or like, I want Cork to, whatever. I mean, do they tell you what they want for this guy?
Often they'll tell me what they didn't want.
Right.
So I have on occasion killed off characters that readers have come to love and to care about deeply. So they end up grieving as if these characters are actually real. Yeah. When I killed off one character in particular, immediately after the release of that book, I got emails that went something like this: "Dear Mr. Krueger, you bastard." So yeah, I do get feedback, and I have lots of people who say, "Oh, you should have Cork do this. You should have Cork do that," or "Can you bring this character back? I would love that character, but I haven't seen the character in a book for a while." So I get lots of suggestions on what readers would like to see for the Cork O'Connor series. I'm sure every writer of a long-running series gets all of those kinds of messages.
Oh yeah, it makes me think. It also makes me think of Arthur Conan Doyle trying to kill off Sherlock Holmes, and
Yeah.
and then his mom wouldn't talk to him, so he had to find a way to had to bring him back. So it's you did an interview last year with the New York Times where you talked about this experience of having known Cork for you now going, I guess, back to the early '90s. So it's this very long relationship. What is that like to have spent? I mean, there are not many authors who have spent that much time with a protagonist. We had CJ Box on the show. I asked him about what that was like with his series, but not many people have these multi-decade series. What is that like for you? What is your relationship with Cork? And do you have a sense of where Cork is going and how the Cork O'Connor story is going to end?
Nope.
Okay, well, that's easy.
Not exactly, anyway. So as you pointed out, Joe, I'm 19 books into the series. I have two more books in the series under contract. I'm just about to finish the next one. It will be called Spirit Crossing, and God willing, it'll be out this time next year. I have no idea what the next story is going to be about in this series. I haven't even gone there in my thinking yet. But Cork is my bread and butter. Cork O'Connor, Tamarack County, the O'Connor clan, Henry Malou. These are characters. They don't exist. And yet they do for readers. Readers have opened their hearts to them, embraced them, hoped for them, feared for them. And so for readers, they are very real. I have kind of this dissociative relationship with my characters. They have occupied an enormous amount of my thinking, my imagination, but I'm aware that they're in my imagination. and so and so if a story dictates that I do some horrible things to characters that readers care about, as an artist, I take that story where the story seems to want to go.
Yeah.
So I can be a little dispassionate in the choices that I make in terms of the series itself. And that, I don't know if readers can relate to that. But the whole creative experience, when you write a book, it's a very dissociative experience, because on the one hand, you are trying to imagine as deeply as you can something that's going on, so that the emotion that needs to be expressed on the page. You have to feel it yourself in order to really uh, give it the proper voice. And at the same time, as an artist, you're standing outside that, making judgments, artistic judgments about what you're doing. So you are inside it, but you are also outside it, if that makes any sense to you.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, a question that I had when I was reading The River We Remember, we'll get to audience questions in a moment, but as I was reading The River We Remember, one thing that sort of struck me, and I don't know what you think about this. This may be off base, but in Iron Lake, first Cork O'Connor book, Cork is, he's already, I forget exactly how old he is, but I mean he's a full grown man, and
He's 40. I
he's
imagine
40,
him
yeah.
at 40 at that point in time.
Yeah, I felt like he was, sort of pushing middle age. He was,
Mhm.
and and then obviously we sort of followed him forward. Some of your more recent books, Lightning Strike was sort of a Cork prequel in a way, in a way. I feel like some of your recent books and some of the ones that I really, really love are kind of going back and exploring coming of age issues. So Lightning Strike, sort of obviously had that quality, Ordinary Grace, This Tender Land. River We Remember, I think, very explicitly talks about coming of age, especially for men, and how does society guide boys into manhood? What are some of the terrible ways that happens in war? What are some of the more adaptive ways cultures can do that? Uh, do you feel that as you've gone along, you felt more drawn towards coming of age stories? And if so, why do you think that is?
Um, the coming of age story is it speaks to such a deep kind of universal in all of us, because everybody's been there. Everybody has made that difficult transition from childhood to adulthood. And it can be a very hard transition to make, because you really don't have guidelines in our society. Back in primitive societies, indigenous societies, there was ritual involved in the transition from childhood to adulthood. It would often involve a vision quest. You would go off and fast, and seek a vision that would, in the tradition, guide you through the rest of your life. And when you came back from that vision quest, you were considered then a part of the adult community. There are native traditions, not in this country, but in other countries, where children are actually buried, and when they are uncovered, they are reborn into the adult experience. But we don't have that. We don't have these rituals, these traditions to go by. And so it has always seemed to me that we stumble our way into adulthood, and we're never quite sure what that means or how to get there. And so I find that rich territory to explore. As you say, Ordinary Grace was probably the first place where I really delved deeply into that issue. This Tender Land, it's front and center in This Tender Land as well. Lightning, I so enjoyed those. Those both came before Lightning Strike, that when I decided to do a prequel, exploring Cork at that same age, that 12, 13, 14-year-old age, just felt very comfortable for me. And in The River We Remember, in the character of Scott Madison and his good friend, I have the same sort of dynamic going on. And it's particular. It comes out of a particular time for these two boys, and it comes at a time that is post-war. We'd come out of two major wars, World War II and the Korean War, And in thinking of America, we had won these wars, we had saved the world. It was a glorious thing, and being a soldier and having been a part of that was a glorious thing. But in the river, we remember these are boys who've lost their fathers in the war. And so they're trying to make sense of what that all means then, you know? Is that the kind of sacrifice that will be expected of them? Is that what it means to be a man? So again, I just go back to this being really rich territory for me as a writer to explore, but I get such good feedback from readers that I know that it's an issue for readers as well. And not just guys, women go through in their own way, the same kind of struggle to move from childhood into their womanhood.
Absolutely. Um, You know, one question I had about it, and this may be a little bit of a deep cut, and maybe there's sort of nothing there, but I did read that early in your life, before you were a full-time writer, one of the jobs you had was working in child development research at University of Minnesota.
Yeah.
And my day job is I'm a child psychologist. I know U Minnesota is a very, very prestigious research psychology program.
Yeah.
I wonder if you say something about that and whether that was something that influenced you as a writer.
Do you know, so I worked for the Institute of Child Development, researching how children develop. And we studied a lot of things. And one of the things that we studied a good deal was resilience in children. And what I came to understand is that children have an enormous capacity for resilience, even if they've undergone tremendous trauma, provided they have the right support as they deal with that trauma. And so when I create, for example, the kinds of things that happen to the kids in this tender land, coming out of a Native American boarding school where the environment was incredibly cruel, physically, sexually, emotionally cruel, I create a group of kids who, because they offer one another support and love and create a family, they're able to rebound from those kinds of things. And it was certainly the research that I was a part of at the university that helped me come to understand that aspect of our development as human beings.
Did you ever think about staying in that field? Do we miss out on having you as a child psychologist? Was that ever anything that drew you?
You know, I thought the work we were doing was important. I enjoyed it tremendously. And the whole time I was doing it, I wanted to be a writer.
Right.
So as soon as I signed my first major book contract, I jumped ship.
You were gone. You were gone. Well, that brings me to my what's going to be my last question before we switch over to audience questions, um, which is about you becoming a writer. Anyone who sort of heard you speak or read about you is familiar with the image of a young William Kent Krueger sitting in the St. Clair broiler in St. Paul, writing at 5:30 in the morning, trying to crank out words before work, before life began. Um, and my question is, was it inevitable that that guy was going to become a mystery writer? Did you always know, or is there like a romance novel from before that that's in a drawer somewhere, and then you eventually came over to how did that happen?
So my father was a high school English teacher, Joe. And when I was 18 years old, he insisted I read Ernest Hemingway, and I fell madly in love with Hemingway. Well, mostly what I fell in love with, in truth, was this mythic image of Ernest Hemingway, that we all have. Um, but I did like his prose. I loved the terseness of his language. I love how he seemed to understand how to put just the right word in just the right place, and his ability to create cadence in his work. I just really admired that. So I tried for a very long time to write the great American novel as Ernest Hemingway as Ernest Hemingway might have written it, which was stupid on so many levels. And in fact, it got me nowhere. So I hit my 40s and went through a midlife crisis and thought, the hell with trying to write the great American novel. I want to write something somebody might actually want to read. So I looked around me to see what people read. You know what everybody reads, Joe? They read mysteries. It's a genre whose appeal cuts across all socioeconomic levels, all age demographics, all ethnic groups. So I decided I was going to write a mystery. Now here's a confession coming from a mystery writer. Before I began to write them, I didn't read mysteries. My father, the high school English teacher, had convinced me that mysteries were the poor stepchildren of literature. So I didn't even read Nancy Drew or the Hardy Boys when I was growing up. And so I had a lot to learn. And the first Cork O'Connor story took me 4 years to write, both because I was learning how to write a mystery and because I was working full time and only able to write for an hour every morning.
That is fascinating. Yeah, and just for the audience, there's a very funny moment in the River We Remember when a character who's an aspiring writer is talking about wanting to write a nonfiction book, and I think is it his wife who says to him, "Why don't you write a mystery or something that people actually want to read?" And that was a funny. It's very funny. So that's really fascinating to me. So two questions that come out of that. One is, so when you were younger, when you were a child, if you weren't a big mystery reader, if you weren't reading Hardy Boys and stuff like that, what grabbed you? What did you love? What did you read when you were young that you loved?
Comic books.
Hmm.
I was a big lover of comic books.
Yeah,
I cut my teeth on DC Comics, and then when Marvel came along, I transitioned to Marvel Comics. And you know, the thing is that what comics are great storylines. They teach you a good story arc. It's all dialogue, so you have to learn how to write. You get a good sense of how to write dialogue from those, and they are stories about conflict. It's kind of the classic conflict, good against evil, but you learn about conflict. So I was huge into reading comic books. But my father, the high school English teacher, had me reading the Iliad and the Odyssey when other kids were reading Nancy Drew.
right.
So I had that literature background as well.
That's interesting. And then when you realized you were a mystery writer, decided to be a mystery writer, was there anybody? Did you make a sort of a concerted effort to kind of do a sort of a tutorial? Was there anybody who you read? Did you decide, oh, I've got to read all of Agatha Christie, or I've got to read all of Chandler, or whatever? Who did you read who sort of taught you the form?
I came most of my found the foundation for my own work is with the American mystery community. So Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, James M. Cain, the darker, harder, grittier writers, as opposed to the classic, traditional, Agatha Christie, Niall Marsh, uh, Dorothy Sayers kind of a thing. Specifically for my work, I was greatly influenced by the work of Tony Hillerman. For readers out there, watchers out there who don't know that name, Tony Hillerman was an icon in the mystery genre. He wrote a series that was set in the Four Corners area of the Southwest and that dealt significantly with the culture of the Navajo, the Diné. And when I discovered Hillerman, I just loved his profound sense of place. I thought he had great character development, and he was able to weave seamlessly this fascinating cultural information into his stories. And when I decided I was going to write a mystery, I thought nobody's doing that with the Ojibwe here in Minnesota. So that's in large measure what led me to my own decision.
That's great. Um, Ken, Renee has a question for you. Renee would like to know, do you have a dog or a cat? Tell us about tell us about the home life. Do you have any four-legged friends?
I wish I could, but I travel so much that I really couldn't leave a pet behind and not feel a lot of guilt for that. So no, we do not have cats. We do not have dogs. If I ever settle down and stop doing all of these events that I do in a year, then I would probably get a dog. I'm kind of a dog guy. I grew up with dogs. Although I've had some very sweet cats over the years when my kids were little.
Another question, I don't have it to put up on the screen, but another audience question is about the research that you do for your novels. Um, that was sort of something that struck me just in reading The River We Remember. There's a moment early in the book, and this is not a spoiler, when the police comment that the body pulled from the river must have been dead before it went in because it floated, and so therefore the lungs were not full of water. And I thought, oh, that's so interesting. That's sort of like an interesting, forensic observation. Um, so yeah, there's in terms of whether it's forensic science, whether it's the law, because there is a trial that's going on in this book. Where do you sort of get your medical and legal and sort of police info?
I just make it up.
Just make it up. No one's going to call you on it.
Actually, cops will call you every time. I feel really fortunate in that that the members of the law enforcement community who have contacted me and who are fans tell me that they think I do a pretty good job with it. And the reason is that, as you probably guessed, Joe, I when it comes down to what I really need, I go to the people who know it. So I've interviewed homicide detectives and street beat cops and coroners and FBI agents and Secret Service agents and district attorneys, you name it. If I've needed it, I've talked to whoever it is who actually does the job, which helps tremendously. But I do an enormous amount of research as well, paper research. So I'm always looking through articles that will help guide me in terms of whatever it is that I need to know, or books. The library is just such a has my heart because I do a lot of work in the libraries.
Yeah, Renee has another question about that. I'll put up in a second. But I think, yeah, it's the research is always interesting. My dad's a retired physician, and he's kind of gotten used to me texting him late at night or early in the morning to say, hey, if you wanted to kill somebody with with mercury, how much would you have to give them, and could they taste it in their food? And I think, and then he'll sort of he'll get back to me about that. Yeah, so
Here's a story in that regard, Joe.
yeah.
That the standalone novel that nobody read is the Devil's Bed. It involves a plot to assassinate the First Lady of the United States, and so I needed to know about, and it involves a Secret Service agent who is in love with her, and it's such a heartwarming story. And so I needed to know about the Secret Service. So I made arrangements to speak to the special agent in charge of the Secret Service office here in the Twin Cities, and went to interview him. I typically I'm a pretty good interviewer, but I almost blew that one because when we sat down to talk, almost the first question out of my mouth was, "So, if I wanted to kill the First Lady, how would I go about that?" This guy had no sense of humor in that regard whatsoever. So my first meeting with him was a little on the chilly side. But when I left that day, I gave him a copy of Iron Lake and said, you might want to read this because I need to come back and ask you some more questions. And he read it. And when I came back, he was very open. His response to me often was, I can't take you there because we're talking about the safety of the First Lady. But he would say, think about it logically, and you're probably going to be right.
You're very lucky nothing happened to any real life first ladies, because you would have been at the top of the list of suspects. Robin over on Facebook has a question about Minnesota and the arts. I think Robin, may have heard you speak before, but yeah, would you talk a little bit about what Minnesota, your resident of St. Paul, and stories are set in Minnesota. Tell us a little bit about Minnesota and support for the arts.
I get questioned all the time when I do events across the country about the first of all, the question is the number of fine mystery writers we have coming out of Minnesota, but it's always often expanded to include just writers in general. A terrific number of spectacular writers make Minnesota their home. But it's not just that. We have terrific dramatists, playwrights who are at work in Minnesota. We have fine videographers who are at work here. We have fine visual artists who are at work here. And I think the reason is that a very long time ago, the people of Minnesota made a commitment to supporting the arts. We have here what's called the Legacy Amendment, and a portion of everyone's taxes goes to support the cultural heritage of Minnesota. And so people here, the populace has put their money where their mouths are, and have in many ways underwritten the arts that are being worked on here in all of Minnesota, not just the Twin Cities. And I think that's a major reason why we have so many artists come here. They gravitate here because they hear about the richness of that artistic community in the Twin Cities. And it's so true.
Yeah. Another question from someone who I know is a big fan of yours. This is my mom, who loves your work.
Hi,
and
Rebecca.
and she would like to know if you have a different process for writing your mysteries, by which I think she means the Cork mysteries,
Yeah.
versus sort of what you've called your novels of the heart.
Yeah. I do follow a very different process for my Cork O'Connor series versus my standalones. The Cork stories are mysteries, and a mystery is a very tightly woven fabric of storytelling. Everything depends so significantly on everything else. And I think that the success of a mystery depends largely on the timing of the reveals. When do you give the reader the clues that are going to be necessary to solving the mystery at the heart of the story? So when I write a mystery in the Cork O'Connor series, I try to think that mystery through as completely as I can before I ever put my fingers to the keyboard. At the end of that thinking process, which can go on for weeks or even months, I know how the story begins, I know how it ends, I know who did what to whom and why, I know the themes that I want to weave through the piece. But my standalones are very different. A mystery is an intellectual construct. It's a puzzle that you create in your head, and you're working like crazy to make sure all the pieces fit perfectly together. My standalones don't come from my head, they come from my heart. And so I wanted a process that would allow the reader to feel like this is not a story that's coming from my head. I'm telling you a story from my heart. And so when I write the standalones, typically as I go into them, I really don't know a lot about the story I'm going to tell. I know a few salient elements that are going to be included, and then I let the story reveal itself to me. And and that worked so incredibly well with Ordinary Grace and This Tender Land. Those were two of the most extraordinary creative experiences I've ever had. And in all honesty, two of the easiest manuscripts I've ever written. I tried to do the same thing with The River We Remember, but The River We Remember has a more significant mystery element to it than either of those two earlier standalones. And what happened, Joe, was I let the head get ahead of the heart. And so I got
Mhm.
so involved in creating the mystery that I forgot about the human element. And when I went back and took a look at it, that's what I saw. I forgot that the people were really the most important aspect of the story. So I rewrote it, bringing the people, their relationships, their conflicts, their inner conflicts, their outer conflicts to the forefront.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So, so Carol, also on Facebook, just sort of as a follow up. So I know you've already told me that you don't know exactly what's going to happen to Cork at the end, but when you sort of talk about the way that you plot his books, and you sort of have to scaffold and plot his books, and their books more of the head than of the heart. When you think about the arc of his story for future books, the one that's coming out next year, hopefully the book after that, do you kind of have a meta outline that spans multiple books?
Occasionally, I have been able to see a book or two ahead,
Right.
but very often it's simply, this is the story that appeals to me now, or this is the issue that my friends in the Native community have made me aware of that I think is important now, and I need to construct a story around that issue. As I look forward in terms of the Cork O'Connor series, Cork will continue to age. I started him as a man of about 40. Now he's approaching 60, or approaching 60. His children have grown up; they have lives of their own, and now they very often play an important part in the stories. They take an active role in the investigations often, or they're the targets of things that have to be resolved for everybody to live happily ever after. And so I'll continue to age Cork, age everybody else, involve them all in the tapestry of the story, the plots that I create. And that's about as far as I can say. As I told you, I had two books under contract. That second book, I have no idea what I'm going to be doing with that next book. And I won't for a while, because as soon as I finish this manuscript, there is a standalone that has been knocking at my door forever, begging me to write. So I'm going to probably spend a couple of years on that.
It's very exciting. It's time for just one more audience question. And you mentioned in that last response, friends in the Native community bringing issues to your attention. Susie asks, has also read your books since Iron Lake and loves them. Do you have someone you call for Indigenous cultural reference?
Yeah, I have several friends in the Native community that whose perceptions and insights and suggestions I highly value. So I talk to them. I will often talk to them before I begin a novel and indicate this is what I want to write about. What do you think? Do you think if I do this, am I going to be trespassing? Is this something I should stay as a white guy? I should stay away from. So I seek their advice in that regard. If I'm green lighted, then I'm always checking in with them to make sure that I'm on track, that I'm being true to the nature of the issue and to the nature of the community's response to that or concern about that. And when the manuscript is finished, then I will typically give it to at least one, but usually two of my Ojibwe friends to read and vet for me. So I haven't said anything that's really too stupid or even worse, offensive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Lots of comments in the audience. Thank you all so much. And we're starting to run low on time. I know that people are hoping that your tour will take you to Florida. I know your tour is on your website. We can post a link to it in the chat. I don't know. Are you Florida bound, Kent? Are you going to make it?
I'm going to be visiting Florida sometime in the winter as part of a special read program. And I'd love to tell you where that is, but I can't remember. I think it's in the Fort Myers area. But watch my website calendar. Toward the end of the year, I'll start posting everything that everywhere that I will be visiting in 2024.
Perfect. And a lot of people also speaking to chatting about your connection with public libraries and speaking in and supporting public libraries. Do you want to say a quick word about that, Kent? Because I know that from following you on social media, that is a big part of your life.
Yeah, if I'm not doing a signing at a bookstore, I'm doing an event for a library. I believe so profoundly that we need to support our public libraries. It, it's so often the situation in which a community that is finding itself in financial difficulties, the first place they look to cut funding is the library, the public library. In my opinion, that should be one of the last places they should be looking. I think of libraries as a cornerstone of our democracy. Free and easy access to information, to literature, is such an important part of who we are as a democratic people. I think of libraries as the archives of our culture. I mean, these are the places that house the books that help us understand where we were, who we were, help us understand where we are now, who we are now, and maybe even point the way to the future, where we're going and who we might become. When our libraries are gone, there goes everything we are as a people.
It is very eloquent and I think a great note for us to wind down on. It has been a complete pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much for joining us on the program. Thank you for being here. Thank you for all of these fantastic books. Thank you to the audience. You've been wonderful. We appreciate all the comments, all the questions. Remember, our program exists for one purpose, and that is to support independent booksellers. So head out either online or in person to support your local indie. Pick up a copy of The River We Remember. It is fantastic. I stayed up way too late finishing this book because, among many other things, it's a riveting mystery. And Cork O'Connor, number 19. And if you haven't read the first 18, work your way up to it. Kent, we very much look forward to the future books, both the standalones and the continuation of Cork O'Connor. So very, very excited. And thank you for being here with us. It's been a true pleasure to speak with you.
I've enjoyed it tremendously, Joe, and thank you for your support of independent bookstores.
Absolutely. To the audience, come back next week, same place, same time. Episode 148, we've got a special one next week. We're actually doing a panel on authors and their day jobs. We are going to have a psychiatrist, an attorney, and an independent bookstore owner. So that will be an interesting conversation. Join us. Until then, stay well and keep reading. Thank you, everybody.